Good morning, conferees. I am Deborah Belle, and I'm thrilled. I am thrilled to welcome you to a revolutionary moment, women's liberation in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Let me just remind folks to silence cell phones. The women's liberation movement of those years changed my life. It is impossible to imagine my academic career, the topics I have studied, the methods I have used, the courses I have taught, or the salary I have received, without the revolutionary women's movement of that era. Beyond that, my experiences of marriage and motherhood, of sex and relationships, and my very sense of self would have been profoundly different if the world had not been changed for me by the women's liberation movement of my early adult years. I am forever grateful to those who created and sustained that movement and thus transformed the world. May I ask the world changers of that era, the activists, intellectuals, novelists, artists, filmmakers, scholars, singers, and poets, and other rabble-rousers to please rise. Several years ago, I emerged from the relative seclusion of my psychology department to become director of women's, gender, and sexuality studies at Boston University. In the years that followed, I was startled on several occasions to encounter a narrative about the women's liberation movement, now often called second-wave feminism, that seemed wildly discrepant from my own memories and understandings. In some retellings, the movement seemed to be anti-sex, or homophobic, or racist, certainly exclusionary and narrow. I was often angered as well as perplexed by these accounts. Then a year or two ago, I attended a screening of an early cut of Left on Pearl, a wonderful film. A wonderful film that tells the story of the 1971 takeover of a Harvard building by women demanding a women's center in Cambridge. For those who don't yet know this amazing story, and we are screening Left on Pearl this evening, along with A Moment in Her Story, another great film about women's liberation in the Boston area, the takeover ended triumphantly with the creation of the Cambridge Women's Center, which stands to this day, more than 40 years later, on Pleasant Street in Cambridge. The film goes on to point out that the Cambridge Women's Center then gave rise to many of the important feminist organizations and institutions that exist in the Boston area today, including the Elizabeth Stone House, on whose board I served in the 1980s. What shocked me was that I was right here in Cambridge in 1971, but was entirely oblivious of the takeover or had long forgotten it. And although I served on the board of the Elizabeth Stone House, I had been unaware that the idea for that program originated at the Cambridge Women's Center. If an ardent feminist who lived in Cambridge at the time of these events, a director of a women's gender and sexuality studies program, could be entirely ignorant of this history, how many others were in the dark? And thus the idea for this conference was born, an opportunity to revisit and remember this revolutionary period and to analyze and perhaps modify the narratives told about it. So you could say that this conference was born out of ignorance and anger. That would be one narrative, and it would not be entirely inaccurate. Or you could say that this conference was born out of gratitude and admiration and awe and love for those who changed the world for us decades ago. That would be another narrative, perhaps a superior one. As originally envisioned, this conference would have brought together 6 or 7 experts in the field to give talks on their work. Then Linda Gordon suggested that a call for papers might bring to us wonderful scholars and activists whom we did not even know and who could enrich our understanding immensely. The call was sent out, and we hope to receive a good number of submissions. We were stunned when proposals began flooding into our inboxes, ultimately over 150 proposals for panels, roundtables, individual papers, poetry readings, film screenings, and song. Clearly, others were also more than ready to re-examine those revolutionary years. Our call for papers had struck a nerve. Today, we hope that our coming together will be many things, certainly a celebration of great accomplishments and amazing women. Also an examination of the many incarnations of the movement across the country and across diversities of race, ethnicity, class, and sexuality. We even dare to hope that the talks and conversations over these few days will help us to think more effectively about the work that lies ahead, and that being with each other in conversation will give each of us more energy to do what can be done. We are grateful to all of you who made the effort to be here today, and to everyone who helped others get to this conference, including those who registered as supporters, mentors, and benefactors. Thank you. We are also grateful to our institutional funders, including Boston University's Center for the Humanities, our Alumni Affairs Office, and the Howard Gottlieb Center for Archival Research, as well as numerous Boston University schools, departments, and programs. We are grateful to our sisters across the river at Radcliffe's Arthur and Elizabeth Schlesinger Library on the History of Women in America, who approached us some months ago asking how they could support this conference. We much appreciate their help. Our graphic artist, Andrea Sutton, designed for us a conference poster and a conference logo we love. Thank you, Andy. Our program coordinator, Jaho King, came on board mid-December and worked miracles to get our website up and running while handling complex logistical issues and an immense correspondence, and keeping the rest of our Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program running smoothly. Thank you, Jaho. You are an amazing woman. Our conference planning committee, including faculty, graduate students, and undergraduates, worked tirelessly and often brilliantly to keep this conference on track and enable it to fulfill its great potential. Words of thanks can never be sufficient. May I ask the planning committee members to please stand? We are also deeply grateful to our student volunteers and especially to our volunteer coordinator, Chelsea Schwalm. You can recognize our volunteers in their conference t-shirts and helpful expressions. They stand by to provide directions for you to conference rooms you wish to find and to assist you if any problems arise. They also, in many cases, would be excellent folks with whom to discuss organizing strategies. If you wish to hold a terrific Take Back the Night march, or you wish to encourage your university administration to create a rape crisis center. I have seen the face of youthful feminism, and it is beautiful. Every conference needs a fairy godmother to make our wishes come true. Ours has been Vita Palladino, director of the Howard Gottlieb Center for Archival Research. We can never thank you enough, Vita. And thanks to everyone whose cogent advice, moral support, and technical assistance have made planning for this conference a great joy. And now, Liane Brandon's 1971 film, Anything You Want to Be. Okay, we have to get Liane Brandon to take a bow. She's right there. Now it is my great honor to introduce Marge Piercy, novelist, poet, activist, visionary. Her talk this morning is entitled, "The War on Women is Part of a Larger War."
Safe sex with the microphone. The war on women is very real and aimed at taking our freedom and our control of our health away. Behind the war on women, who does not control her body? A slave. Aging white men addicted to power cannot stand girls and women choosing for themselves. They dream of bringing back those patriarchal days when women in pearls like tiny teeth, rustling in taffeta, brought platters of Betty Crocker cakes, salads of raisins or carrots and celery in orange jello, to men who barely needed to acknowledge their labor because God willed it so. They want the others crushed back into their places, smiles glued on, costumes intact, ready to serve as a punchline of jokes shared over cigars. Those were the days and nights of subservience only available now if they pay for it. Their anger swells until solidified into punitive laws that will strip women of choice, of their uppity freedoms, of life itself, to bring back those glorious Father knows best chastity-built days. I spent a lot of time and energy in my life to make sure no girl or woman ever has to go through what I did when I was 18 and had to abort myself and almost bled to death, or the terrors and pain I shared with other women when I was helping them get abortions during the times it was illegal. We are losing the battle. We are not countering the guilt-based propaganda of the anti-choice people with a defense that moves women. Ethics for Republicans. An embryo is precious. A woman is a vessel. A fertilized egg is a person. The woman is indentured to it. An embryo is sacred until birth. After that, he, she is on their own. Abortion is murder. Rape, incest are means to an end. That precious fertilized egg housed in an expendable body. Let us make babies and babies and babies. Children are something else. Probably future criminals, probably welfare cheats whose education hikes taxes. You can freely dispose of them. Somehow we need to recapture that sense of enthusiasm, the exhilaration of being active in history, capture it in some new form. But one of the reasons it is hard to keep any movement going now is the economy. In the 60s, I could work part-time and have a great deal of time for politics. Only 5% or so has freedom now. People work 2 jobs to survive in poverty or near it. Moving on up. My great-grandmother had 2 choices: eat grass or die even more quickly of starvation. My grandmother had 2 choices: get raped and killed in a pogrom or escape Lithuania illegally under a load of straw. To bear 11 children with never enough of anything except babies. My mother had 3 choices: marry some guy with a job, go on being a chambermaid, fighting off the grabby hands of salesmen, become a prostitute. She married 3 times to working men who abused her till death. She could not imagine life beyond the female ghetto. I had several choices: to repeat my mother's, except work in an office instead of a cheap hotel, put myself through college over my parents' objections since they expected me to crouch in their home spitting out weekly tiny paychecks. I could choose sex rather than marriage. I could live off my own labor lifelong and explore my freedom. Guess what I chose? Granddaughters of my brain and labor, before you a myriad of doors. Don't fuss to be skinny. Don't open the door to the tiger of repression. Take the one with sunshine behind it, the hot one. Feed, strengthen your body, make love to your freedom, marry it. Then leave your own daughters a whole world of choice. But we must understand that the attempt to take away a woman's control over her body is part of a larger attempt to take away any real control over the lives of most of the population. Now corporations and the very wealthy 1% control elections. Now the media are propaganda machines, and the only investigative reporting is on Comedy Central or the web. The powers that be have granted certain social rather than economic gains. We'll have legalized marijuana and gay marriage in every state while unions are being crushed and the safety net of the New Deal and the Johnson era are being abolished one law at a time. We have some social gains and many economic losses. The real earning power of working people diminishes every year. We are losing the power battle. Class warfare. Class warfare, the Republicans bellowed when the protests and occupations began. But haven't you noticed, this war has been going on since we tore off from England. Cut health care to those who most need it. Let infant deaths soar among mothers who can't pay for doctors' visits. Cut the real wages and raise rents and gas prices. Foreclose on mortgages, letting whole neighborhoods rot so those still in their houses live next to meth labs while abandoned pets starve under bushes gone wild. Chain those who manage to get into college to debts the size of elephants to drag behind them into middle age. Make drugs so costly folks can't afford to live. Class warfare, we were born into it. We eat it for breakfast, we slurp it for lunch, we dine on it and sleep in it and die of it years earlier than the rich. Who has little, let them have less. The hatred of the poor, is it guilt gone rancid? That the rich have so much and still conspire to steal a baby's medicine, a woman's life, a man's heart and kidney? When those Congress people talk of people who are counting their last change for gas or eggs, choosing between cold and hunger, they snarl, how dare we exist? If they could push a button, if they could warn the poor here at home as they do abroad directly with bombs instead of legislation, think they'd hesitate? The righteous anger fermenting in them boils over in cuts to whatever keeps people alive. They punish those who have little with less. A vast legal bus to run us over.
This morning's keynote address will be delivered by Sara Evans, Regents Professor Emeritus in the History Department at the University of Minnesota. Her talk is entitled, Clearing Away the Myths to See the Revolution.
We had fun coming up with that title. There was a little email back and forth between me and the staff of the conference. And then I realized once they came up with this title, I had to talk about it. So that kind of set my agenda. It's such an honor to be speaking to this group. It's full of people that I know or people that I feel like I know. And every conversation in the hall, we find lines of connection. So I'm just honored to be here to be doing this. And I want to offer whatever I say in the spirit of conversation and debate. Disagreement is not a bad thing. We all learned that early on. A colleague of mine, actually a former student who teaches a course on the history of feminism at Wayne State, just sent me a document last week. It started like this. Approximately 50 members of the 5 Chicago radical women's groups met on Saturday, May 18th, 1968, to hold a citywide conference. The main purposes of the conference were to create and strengthen ties among groups and individuals, to generate a heightened sense of common history and purpose, and to provoke imaginative programmatic ideas and plans. In other words, the conference was an early step in the process of movement building. That is from the journals founded by Joe Freeman that gave us our name, Voice of Women's Liberation, in the June 1968 edition. The byline credits Sarah Boyd. You have to have known me more than 40 years to know that that's me. It's a little startling, and a number of us here can have this experience, to see yourself in a document in an archive. We need to, but I just want to say that you know, also I'm self-interested here. I'm here as a scholar, but I'm also here, I was a scholar, and I am a scholar because the movement sent me there. So I want to start the conversation with a definition. I love the title of this conference, but nowhere does anybody stop and say, so what is this thing? What are the boundaries of, are we talking about the same thing? So I made a stab, and I assume that coming to terms with what we really mean by women's liberation will be a thread in all of the conversations that we have today. And I offer this in the spirit of that conversation, knowing even I will probably have modified it by, by tomorrow night. But here's the definition that came to me. Women's liberation was a radical, multiracial feminist movement that grew directly out of the New Left, civil rights, anti-war, and related freedom movements of the 1960s. Its insight that the personal is political, its intentionally decentralized structure, and its consciousness-raising method allowed it to grow so fast and with such intensity that it swept up the liberal feminist organizations like NOW in a wildfire of change. In this sentence, I tried to avoid the metaphor of wave, so I ended up with wildfire, but I'm going to fall back into wave, even though I know there's all kinds of debates about that metaphor. After 1970, women's liberation, or women's lib, a term coined mostly by the press, was a label appropriated by a very wide variety of groups of women who may have had little or no connection to its originators. So that's what I'm working with. What I'm saying here is that women's liberation was the spark that lit the fire. Temporal boundaries are a little hard to draw. Like, I'm a historian. We usually, in our titles, subtitles, always subtitles, have, from this year to this year. We can locate many of the first women's liberation groups starting in 1967 and 68, but there are numerous precursors that make trying to precisely define the founding moment a little difficult, a little fuzzy. Many of the original groups and their successors persisted until the mid-70s, but changing contexts and structures and ideas, as well as the incredible breadth of this movement, make it impossible to locate the moment when women's liberation merged or morphed into something else, or at least I can't tell you when that moment was, but I do know the label itself as a self-definition was pretty much gone sometime in the first half of the 1970s, superseded by labels like radical feminist, socialist feminist, lesbian feminist, womanist, or just feminist. For many decades, in the ways we talked about the second wave, the words women's liberation receded into brief mentions of the rise of late 20th century feminism, the younger radical branch. It shows up again and again and again in different stories. I think only recently, in the last 1 or 2 decades, have we begun to have a serious literature that explores that history, that early history, and many of the authors of those pieces are here, and we have much to learn from them and from each other. But it's time to look back, and this conference is so appropriate. It's I can see how surprising it was to the organizers, but in a sense, it's not surprising. You gave us a chance to come back and think about this. So I want to start with why women's liberation has until recently been a minor footnote in the dominant narratives about late 20th century feminism. I do think that, for one thing, historians were mostly looking at other things. Feminist history was we had to invent a field, and most of my colleagues were working on other things in those first couple of decades, not looking at the history of the movement that sent them to do that work. In the meantime, it got subsumed into a series of myths and stereotypes about second wave feminism. And I think it was caught up in the theorizing. That's where feminist scholarship went, towards that theorizing of second wave feminism, and it became a foil. I want to argue, and others have, I'm drawing on other people, that in the 80s and 90s, feminist scholars, mostly literary and theoretical, who were struggling with the conundrums of race, class, and gender, they fixed the perception of second-wave feminists in the 1970s as white, middle-class, self-interested, and anti-sex. Their version of being a third wave under the rubric of intersectionality presumed an almost total rupture with earlier feminist theorizing, and I would argue cut them off from their own roots. Other myths that have stood in our way are more common to the popularized versions of second-wave feminism and have made it hard to see the critical role of women's liberation in the reemergence of feminism. This is what I think of as the simplistic, media-dominated, and often New York-centered version starring famous women, Betty Friedan, Gloria Steinem. It offers a chronology that tracks big legislative and judicial decisions like Roe v. Wade and ERA, and it relegates women's liberation to a very brief mention as if the radicals were on the edge of the movement and not at the center. Then there are the myths that come straight from the opponents of the movement. Shrill, man-haters, ugly, anti-sex, oversex, all lesbian. I mean, these things don't contradict one another, but that didn't matter, and still doesn't. And I would say that some of those myths remain a genuine obstacle for contemporary activists and for students in our classrooms. And finally, there is what I'm going to call a myth of rupture that renders the new left irrelevant to feminism because of its sexism, and I'm going to come back to that. I'm going to come back to each one of these. A lot of us have chafed at these assumptions for a long time. Some of us have written books to challenge them, but very few have isolated this revolutionary moment for closer examination. And I can name a number. Alice Eccles, Linda Gordon and Roz Baxendall's Dear Sisters was a major intervention in that. The Feminist Memoir Project was another, and Carol Giordina has recently published a book that looks at the New York, Gainesville, Florida nexus and tracks that out. So let me go back to these four, and I'm sure you can come up with many others. I think the first thing we have to do is challenge the idea that women's liberation was white and middle class. This gets linked to all sorts of other things about being anti-sex, anti-motherhood, and so forth, but what we know is that women's liberation erupted in every facet of the 1960s freedom movements. Benita Roth, Kimberly Springer, Maylai Blackwell, Beverly Guy Sheftall, Sonia Shah, Sherry Moraga, and dozens of others have traced the lineages of feminism in African American, Chicano, American Indian, and Asian American movements. Carol draws on a rich array of Black feminist writings and actions, both before and after the initiation of self-named women's liberation groups, and she traces multiple lines of communication and multiple influence. As an expression of the New Left, women's liberation was inspired very directly by the models of Black power and anti-colonial revolutions. Models that often had different meanings, I would argue, for white women and women of color. Subsequent generations have rightly seen, in the words of white feminists in the late 60s and early 70s, an untenably unified concept of woman, that we, which is so essential to movement building, but which can't ultimately collapse the incredibly diverse experiences of half the population. So many efforts to define what that was kept falling short. But the problem is, later generations failed to notice that from the beginning, women of color raised the problem of their double and triple jeopardy and pointed to the sharp differences in experience when gender intersects with race and class. It won't do to erase the strategic and theoretical feminist voices of women like Pat Robinson, Frances Beale, Eleanor Holmes Norton, Florence Kennedy, Elizabeth Martinez, Shirley Lim, and I could go on and on. This is a really long list. I guess what I want to say is that to acknowledge that conversations about race were difficult is altogether different from claiming that there were no such conversations. Women's liberation was multiracial from the outset. But, and this is in fact, I think, a critical aspect, it was very rarely interracial. So those conversations were difficult and often took place in separate places, but race was often at the center of its discourse from the get-go. Even the so-called feminist Politico split, which I would say outside New York was more often a debate than a split, politicos feared detaching women's liberation from the struggles over race and class. But feminists overtly took Black power as their model. So in neither case was there a sense of total rupture. It was really, really complicated. I want to argue that we have to clear away the myth of all white to get at the generative aspects of the conversations and debates that did occur, and to understand why and how they were so difficult. The emergence of intersectionality as a theoretical concept did not so much represent a break with former feminist theorizing as it was something that grew directly out of those early conversations and the conundrums that those debates revealed. So, myth number one. Secondly, I want to argue that women's liberation as a radical New Left movement was huge, and it was confined neither to major cities nor to the United States. As someone who's active in the South, I could go on and on about this because the invisibility in some of the mainstream accounts is profound. I'm going to save some of those comments for a later panel. But I want to make a point here about internationalism. The term women's liberation owes much to the Vietnamese and to anti-colonial struggles. The word liberation was on everybody's lips, the National Liberation Front. It was just all over. I also want to point out that anti-war and anti-colonial movements during what has been referred to as the International 1968, what was going on here was part of an eruption that was worldwide. And those movements around the world spawned feminist movements in countries like Japan, Mexico, France, Germany, Italy, and England, just for starters. And what happened in those countries was not in imitation of what was going on here, which was just barely getting started. Each had its own history and roots, but what's amazing is the founding stories are remarkably similar. And they all share a focus on personal freedom, an emphasis on the body runs throughout them, and a radically egalitarian willingness to challenge every form of hierarchy. We were part of something international, and there was communication. It was fitful, it was partial, there were a few friendships back and forth, but papers were sent around, just like those mimeograph papers that were generated here. Third, that stuff about shrill and ugly points to the militance of women's liberation and the radical, utopian, sometimes apocalyptic expectations of a particular moment in time, both here and around the world. The belief that everything could change, maybe overnight, that revolution was possible and even imminent. That meant that people threw their whole lives into the struggle, and the stakes were very high. It also meant that people burned themselves out. I mean, a lot of people here can tell stories of having to go recover for a while when it didn't just happen. And this is one of the things that I think is hardest to communicate to younger generations who live in a much more cynical time. But it drove a willingness to experiment, to try anything, to do all kinds of stuff. I think the radicalism of women's liberation, compared to the liberal movement, which I hasten to point out also had its own deep roots in the left, but they're deeper and generationally different. But the radicalism of women's liberation was its cultural challenge, not just to unjust laws, although there were tons of those, but to the very definitions of male and female, the willingness to rethink things at their root, which is what radical means. The entire system we then called sex roles, or sociologists gave us that word. Today, many people would use the term gender. Women's liberation linked structural inequalities to lived personal experience. And the personalist political erased boundaries between public and private and broke open a lot of conversations. I've thought and written other places about the pros and the cons of all of that. We paid prices for things that we said that were both wonderful and left us with other problems to deal with. The writings coming out of those early years of women's liberation have been so frequently cited and anthologized that it's very clear they were foundational to everything that came next. It's just that their source has been kind of obscured. They just show up as if they popped out of nothing. I think the energy and intensity of those first 2 to 3 years can't be overstated. It's very hard to communicate to people today in a cynical time. The arguments were fierce because the stakes were high. In many places, that energy shifted very quickly from naming the problem to doing something about it. In many groups, whatever you named, whatever came up became the thing that you worked on. Whether you started a journal, wrote a book, created a daycare center, set up softball teams and karate classes, organized clerical workers, held a demonstration, or dramatized your issues with guerrilla theater. There is a reason that the August 1970 women's strike was so massive, and the label that the media picked up from the demonstrations across the country, it was not just 5,000 or 50,000 women on Fifth Avenue, it was everywhere. And the label the media picked up for what women wanted was women's liberation. Finally, I want to correct the myth that women's liberation was caused by extreme sexism in the New Left and civil rights movements. This myth allows subsequent generations to feel sorry for New Left women, to distance themselves from an experience they think was outrageous and back then, and to imagine that the preceding social movements were irrelevant from that moment of rupture. The broader pattern is pretty clear. The founding documents of every branch of late 60s feminism born from radical and anti-colonialist movements, whether in the United States or around the world, cite the sexism women experienced in the movements that gave them birth. That is true. They were angry, sometimes extremely angry, but not, I would argue, because those movements were worse than other environments. In fact, they were substantially better, because as activists, women had developed the tools of movement building, analyses of how power operates, a radically egalitarian vision, organizing skills, and courage. Those movements were what some of us have called free spaces, environments that enabled a new sense of possibility by giving women not only egalitarian ideas, but also the skills to challenge structures and attitudes that stood in the way of realizing them. And I just want to say that the parallels to what happened to women in the abolition movement in the 1830s and 40s are very strong here. While sexism was in the air everywhere, I just invite you to go back and look at Mad Men, to remember, if you weren't there, to get to sort of go, oh, duh, how pervasive sexist attitudes were and how unapologetic people were about expressing them. Okay, they were everywhere, and they were in the movements that breathed that air. But these were women who could smell its toxic odor, and they had the skills and the confidence to act. Their feminist reaction to sexist colleagues and comrades, "How dare you treat us that way?" took them in a new direction and allowed them to name the lived experiences of millions of women who at that point, and there's a whole other argument that we need to understand about the structural shifts in American society that made millions of women ready to hear the naming and ready to join in. That they did that and how they did it was shaped by their activist roots, and we're going to be thinking about in panel after panel after panel in the next 2 days. I'm excited to hear. But this is where I think some of the local studies can help us begin to understand both what works so well and to wrestle with the movement's limitations. The creative outpouring of new ideas, organizations, and institutions coexisted with dilemmas that were never fully resolved. Race was a deep division. It was never outside the conversation, and the movement was never monoracial, but it was not an issue that was resolved either. It's wrestling with it as a legacy we continue to deal with. Class shaped how and where activists organized and built institutions, and I want to refer you to a wonderful chapter on Detroit by Ann Inke, who is now Finn Inke. it's just astonishing how people with, every good intention end up by the very location of where they put a center or something, who came and what happened there. So class was powerful. The effort to find the truth, or some people would even say the correct line, led some places to a kind of feminist sectarianism as one group split off from another over ideological differences. And finally, we all know that the attacks on leaders caused many brilliant trailblazers to burn out or withdraw. These were also parts of this huge ferment. And I believe we need our history. We don't need to romanticize it. We need to understand it. Women's liberation disappeared from the landscape, a victim mostly, in my view, of its success, but also of the massive backlash that it provoked. Utopian expectations of overnight massive change were not tenable by the mid-1970s, and you can track this in large economic measures, what people felt was possible. And many people by then were burned out in the effort to get there. But women's liberation did change the world as we know it. Future generations need shoulders to stand on, even imperfect ones. We can't forget this. We have to pass it on. Thank you.